It's been many years now that the best chess player is a computer, basically.
Yeah.
There's and that's not going to change, right? It's just now kind of a fact.
I'm with Professor Vincent Bindschaedler, a professor in the computer science department.
Right.
And yeah, I'm thankful that you're here. Appreciate your time. So I wanted to ask you first, your research is very interesting because it's like two popular topics, I would say, like machine learning and data privacy security. But the intersection of the two, I would say it's not that common, at least in the mainstream, or like people don't really think of it. Oh, that's something that I can do. So I wanted to ask you, like, how did you end up there? Like, how was the transition from in your school, and what picked up your interest to end up doing this kind of research?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an emerging kind of research topic that sort of has emerged in the last few years, in part due to kind of advances in machine learning and deep learning. Personally, when I started doing my PhD, I wanted to work on mostly data privacy, sort of computer security and data privacy type problems. But at the same time, what's sort of going on was that there was this kind of revolution where this sort of topic, AI, machine learning, had gone through a kind of a dead period in the 80s, 90s, and then in sort of the early 2000s, it started picking back up, and people realized, oh, these things are actually very useful. There are things we can do with them, and once they sort of had a few applications of what we now call deep learning, there were all of a sudden kind of problems that had to do with confidentiality of data, privacy of data, security problems. If you imagine that you would deploy some of the machine learning systems in the real world, and people also realized, well, maybe we can use some of this technology to actually solve security and privacy problems in some ways. And so there was sort of this natural opening for, I would say, maybe the people that were doing kind of security and privacy research to start playing around with some of the machine learning techniques, and maybe also on the other side from some of the machine learning practitioners to sort of start looking at some of the security and privacy, either applications of their techniques and the techniques that we're working on, but also security and privacy problems that might arise if they were to take those techniques and actually build a system around them and deploy it in the real world.
Yeah, so I think we can come back on the security and privacy side, but we can also touch on the history a little bit and take a step back and explain what are we talking about first, like the history of machine learning, what exactly is it, what is artificial intelligence, because I think the history is also pretty interesting, and it might even tie a little bit from your experience. So when you were doing graduate school, it was probably around the time that it was like peaking the hype, and everything was exploding. You touch on this a little bit, that everybody started realizing that, wow, this is actually useful and powerful. Like, this is a tool that can impact a bunch of areas.
Right. So maybe we can start with sort of machine learning. So I guess you would say machine learning is a subfield of AI, artificial intelligence. It has to do with techniques where you're trying to learn from data, usually kind of large amounts of data. And so you're trying to build these models that are able to make predictions and make decisions effectively. But the way you're doing it is, instead of having sort of hard-coded rules, which you might think of as the other way we solve problems, let's say programming, where you just kind of, the humans has in mind what you want the program to do. in machine learning, what we basically do is we throw a bunch of data at what we call a learning algorithm, and the learning algorithm is supposed to figure out statistical patterns and relationship between the input and output, and hopefully learn to do something useful from that. So artificial intelligence is actually a fairly old idea. I mean, it goes back, I believe, at least to the 1950s. I mean, one example, for example, is Alan Turing, I think, first program to play chess, I think in early 1950s, 1951. So there was always this kind of interest in sort of trying to get intelligent machines, right? So it's one thing to have kind of computers that can just follow instructions. It's another if you get something that you might think of as sort of intelligence. And it's not clear that we're there, but sort of in the process, what's come out of it is these machine learning techniques that actually are useful in the sense that they have applications in the real world, some of which we use, every day. And basically, it took a long time for people to, I guess, unleash the power of these techniques. And it came about through, I guess, a kind of a set of events that sort of at just the right condition, right? So that there needed to be some algorithmic breakthroughs. It needed to be the case that you had enough computation to actually train those machine learning models of the right complexity so you could do interesting things with them. And it also needed to be the case that you had the kind of data and the quantity of the data that you need for this to work. And this really only came about, I think, in the early 2000s, although many of the techniques were sort of thought of, in the 80s or even earlier.
Yeah, I think, and it was cool that you mentioned Alan Turing. Did you see the movie, The Imitation Game?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really cool movie, and it doesn't really touch on these topics. It's more like his life and the stuff that he worked on for the war efforts. But it's pretty cool that if you look a little bit deeper into his life, that he started thinking about these problems in the 50s, which we didn't have what we would call computers. It was just like mechanical things, like switches and stuff, and he was already thinking that in the future we would have, or at least he had the hope that we would have this kind of machines that would imitate how we process information. And the learning then came a little bit later, which is basically like the algorithms, the idea of just using data, and which is what we do, right? Just like we experiment with the world, we observe it, and based on our observations, based on our data that we're collecting, we can get better understandings of what everything is or how to act in your environment. And I think also that you mentioned it's pretty cool that maybe not a lot of people realize is that it exploded right. It's exploding, or it has been exploding for a couple of years. For the stuff that you mentioned, that we have the computation right now, like computers have been increasingly getting more and more powerful, and people have been interacting with data, the internet, so data is more available everywhere. Like if you think of Google, you can just Google anything. Like if you want to see what a species or of a plant in Latin America is, you can just Google it and you'll get a picture, and that's just wonderful, right? And there's big giant data sets that people have that we can leverage those, right? So where did your journey came about in all of this history? And if you want to touch on something that I said earlier.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I guess it's worth pointing out, like the contribution of Alan Turing were quite significant. I mean, and he touched sort of many different things. So one of the ones I mentioned is this idea of playing chess, which actually has its own kind of history within AI, because it's which is really interesting. But another one, of course, is the Turing machine, which is sort of the theoretical model for computers.
And what is it?
Yeah, so I mean, the Turing machine is kind of an abstract model of what it means to do computation and kind of run an algorithm, right? So you know, in the 50s and so at that time, essentially, as you mentioned, there were no computers, not in a way we would recognize today, but there were already people like, you know, Turing and von Neumann and people like that who were actually thinking about, well, if we're going to have a field of computer science, you know, there needs to be some kind of foundations, right? There needs to be, you have to have some concepts, you have to have some way of doing things, and so on. And so, you know, a lot of the work that makes what, you know, we can enjoy nowadays, you know, sort of started back then, even though, as you say, they didn't have what we would consider a modern computer, but they could still kind of think of what you would need to do and what were the kind of important problems to think about. The other thing, though, that's perhaps relevant to artificial intelligence is this idea of a Turing test. So the Turing test is basically, you know, can you have some kind of, you could call it an artificial intelligence, you could call it something else, but can you have something that is able to convince a human that it's not a computer? So it's like, you know, can you have a computer that's so convincing that can mimic sort of human conversation and kind of fool a human being? And that was sort of presented as a kind of criterion for what it would mean to get, you know, artificial intelligence. I think it's perhaps better thought of as what it would mean to have kind of really good mimicry of certain things that a human can do, right? Because it's not clear that to be able to mimic what we can do as human actually requires intelligence or even kind of human level intelligence.
Yeah, because it's funny,
you might
like,
define that.
in the past, like, it's, oh, when we solve this, we'll finally achieve intelligence and stuff like that. And when we kind of solve it right now, it's like, oh no, it's not really, because the people that developed the algorithms that can kind of solve the Turing test right now, they say that we haven't really reached what we would call human level intelligence. Yeah,
I think that's a fair statement. I think the breakthroughs and sort of what we are able to do right now with, let's say, things like deep learning is really useful, and some of these applications are potentially can have huge impact on society and our lives. But I don't think that it follows that they're anywhere near you know, what you might call artificial intelligence or even kind of human level intelligence. It is true, though, that there are some tasks that with, you know, deep learning techniques can be solved better than humans, right? So some perception task. I mean, another example I mentioned is chess. So, you know, it's been many years now that the best chess player is a computer, basically.
Yeah.
And you know, that's not going to change, right? It's just now kind of a fact of
like no human can beat the best computer.
Exactly.
The best computer playing chess. So, and you were saying about that it hasn't reached a human level intelligence. I think that might probably be one of the misconceptions that people have, that as an outsider wonders, it's really difficult to measure the progress in this field, because I would argue that even the people inside the field disagree a lot on where we are, on where the technology is, and even where it's going. So what other misconceptions would you say people attribute to these fields that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, so the one you mentioned, I think, is definitely a big one, which is the idea that if you're able to solve a problem by throwing a lot of compute and a lot of data at it, then it's necessarily intelligent. I mean, ultimately it depends on what you mean by intelligent, but I think there's a big difference between sort of having learned to do a task through, you know, deep learning, to basically picking out patterns in huge data sets and actually understanding what's going on. And common criticism that you hear from some people working in the field is that some of what we kind of present as sort of demonstration of what we can do is really maybe no better than kind of mimicry. So an example for people is language models. So in the last 5 years, there's been a big set of results into the improvements on language models. So these are models that seemingly can help you do any type of natural language processing tasks. So you can use them to complete sentences, answer questions, and the best of them is even able to do stuff that looks like reasoning, right? So they're able to kind of you can ask a question that requires that seems to require some level of reasoning, and it's able to give it's able to give the right answer, but it's not clear that it actually understands what's going on, right? So you could come up with example of some of these things, of what it can do, but is that kind of intelligence? I guess another misconception might be, I guess, the pace of what's going on. I think a lot of people think that we might be closer than we are in terms of getting more and more powerful and more intelligent systems. I think the limitation here is that just because you have success on some applications, meaning you maybe have found whichever applications, if you throw enough data, enough computation at it, you can do really cool things, and they are really cool things. They're actually interesting use. Doesn't mean that other things that you might be trying to do are going to be easy to solve. You can imagine all sorts of maybe societal consequences to think about this, right? So maybe stuff that requires simply understanding a document, maybe doing something about it by just parsing natural language might be something that is close within reach, but then something that we as humans consider rather simple task might actually be kind of a long ways away. So for example, picking up some objects and moving it around, and I don't know, which object you pick up depends on something that you have to get from the environment or something like that. This might be, we might be much further away than we think, right? So it's not that we're making uniform progress on everything that is potentially solvable with the current paradigm.
Yeah, and it's pretty interesting because there's this concept called artificial general intelligence that people throw around a lot, because you might think of it as like the goal maybe of having a computer that could basically do everything that a human can and even more. But it's interesting because we have become better than humans, as you said, in many areas, but in other areas we're still like babies. Like when you come to robotics and like trying to grasp something and the right level of force, and know that you can grab it like this from here and here and not like this because this will pop out, something like that. We're still like babies. We don't have really that the computers doesn't really have that understanding, and so it's really interesting that we have in this, if you can think of it as like this field of like what humans can do. We're better in some areas, we're worse in some areas. There's not really a cohesive model that can do many different things. For example, there's models that can do many different games and stuff like that, play different games, but there's not really a model that can play different games and speak to you and grab stuff. And I think that's how far away, and yeah, just asking how far away might be like a unfair question because nobody knows, but you can just give it a go.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things we can say about that. I mean, one is you're right that there's this concept of AGI, artificial general intelligence, that I don't think we're anywhere close to. I will say I don't think there is any reason that we won't get there. Like, I don't think there is anything special about the human brain that could not be replicated by right algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
But clearly what we're good at doing is very specific tasks. And part of that, to connect it to some of the things you say, is that we sort of have this one kind of success story, which is sort of this kind of deep learning paradigm where we throw a whole bunch of data and a lot of computation in this kind of statistical learning paradigm at the problem. But what I think we've had much less success with is having any kind of abstract reasoning, any kind of symbolic reasoning into those systems. So the example you were giving with your water bottle is that if you want to understand how to grab an object for it not to break, or you have to have some kind of intuitive physics, right? It's not clear how you would learn that from data, and even if you could learn it from data, it's not clear how you would come up with the data that you would use to even learn that. So I think, and I don't think that's an unpopular view. I think perhaps many people agree with, but maybe what you need is some kind of combination of the statistical kind of deep learning techniques we have with maybe more kind of rule-based abstract reasoning type techniques in order to solve some of these problems that so far we're kind of far from.
And I agree, because I've spoken to people that are working in industry solving problems with AI and robotics problems. So I interned in I've interned in like a robotics company, you would say, but even in robotics or dynamics, as you said, like grabbing objects or how to predict where somebody's gonna go based on where they're walking, stuff like that. People, for example, have given me the argument that using machine learning models takes away from the understanding. Like just using data, it blinds you of just keep throwing more data and hoping that it works instead of really understanding what would mean to grab something. Do you think that's a problem? And yeah, like you've mentioned that you could do both, and I really like the idea. And probably, would you say there's many people working on that problem of integrating the two?
I don't actually know how many people have been. I know there's most of the people are certainly working on the sort of more deep learning, kind of machine learning type, and less of the kind of abstract reasoning. I wouldn't know exactly what the breakdown is, but yeah, to answer your question, I think we have to kind of distinguish different things we're talking about, right? So there's maybe this assumption that people have that if you can solve something with some kind of machine learning or AI technique, that you understand what the solution is and how it works. And I think that's clearly not true, right? If you look at deep neural networks, they are largely black box, and there's been a lot of progress in people trying to interpret what they're doing. And so you can get some type of understanding as to what's going on internally. But even that doesn't mean that you've achieved kind of artificial intelligence, right? I think we may just have to accept that there is a difference between the ability to solve a problem and really understanding what's going on in the world, right? So we'd imagine maybe some number of years from now that there are some problems that we're able to solve, and the reason we're able to solve them is not because we've actually created an artificial intelligence that really understands what's going on, but we've just sort of maybe thrown enough data at the problem that 99.9% of the cases are just patterns that can be recognized and then followed, and then in the 0.01% of the cases, then maybe you have some human intervention to kind of correct the thing. but none of that involves necessarily understanding how things are.
And I will have to talk to a neuroscientist about this, because I'm wondering, could you argue that just picking up patterns and applying them, is that basically what we're doing? Maybe you could argue that, and it'd be interesting because something that we didn't mention that I think it's a cool fact, that we're talking about deep learning models, that kind of like the idea behind them, it's modeled after how our brains work. That's partly the reason that it's called neural networks, because of the neurons in our brains. So like people have kind of an understanding in psychology, in neuroscience, of how neurons work, at least a little bit, and they took that model, they put it in like a algorithm and see what happens, and it turned out it does really good work, right? And that's kind of surprising, right? I would say that it kind of surprises me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is surprising. I think maybe not now, but sort of around 10 years ago, when deep learning started to take off, I think some people were surprised of how powerful these things could be if you add the right neural network architecture and the right data in terms of amount and quality. I would say that it's not exactly clear how related the sort of neural network architectures we have today are, how they work compared to the human brain, just because I think while we probably have some kind of rudimentary understanding of the brain, if you talk to a neuroscientist, I don't think it's nearly as complete as we'd like. But I don't think that's necessarily a problem, because it sort of depends what your goal is, right? If your goal is to replicate human intelligence, then clearly there's a big gap there. But if your goal is to have something that perhaps is similar in some ways to what we think we understand about the brain, and then solve interesting problems with sort of the computer equivalent of that, then you don't really need to actually fully understand. You don't need to do it in the same way that the brain necessarily does it. The other thing that you brought up, which I think is quite interesting, is that I was talking about understanding and saying, well, maybe these things are not really there's a difference between understanding and being able to do it. It's true that we don't know to what degree we as humans understand certain things. I mean, there are clearly certain things we understand. People have an intuitive model of physics or something like that. You understand if there's something on the table and you sort of kick it off the table, it's going to fall due to gravity. But there might be many things that we are doing as humans that is actually just some kind of pattern that we've learned, and we basically repeat that, and without really understanding why that's the right thing to do. And the reason we do that is because it works. And in that way, a neural network that has picked up some patterns from the data is in some sense doing the same thing. So I think that's a valid point.
Yeah. And we're talking about surprises. What would you say? What's something that happened in the general field of computer science? It can be just computer science that has surprised you. That's something that happens and you say, "Whoa! Like this is getting real."
Wow, that's a good question. I have to think about it for a moment.
Go for it.
I mean, I think looking back, there are quite a few things. I don't know that there were any where I was kind of surprised, I guess, in real time. Although I did not, I admit I did not see kind of the power of deep learning coming. I think many of us were surprised by what it could do if you could give it, the right amount of data and the right amount of compute. But there are other things that, if you had sort of thought about it ahead of time, it's not clear that you would have understood the significance. So maybe one of them is sort of the impact of cryptography, specifically kind of public key cryptography, right? So there's this 1978 paper by Rivest, Edelman, and Shamir and The paper they proposed the famous kind of RSA crypto system,
I'm familiar. Yeah.
and that ended up basically enabling tons of applications on the internet. And the reason you can nowadays sort of browse the internet and have kind of secure connection, you see the padlock on your browser, is basically because of the kind of the field of public key cryptography, which is a sub part of the field of cryptography that came out of this fairly simple idea. And the idea was, well, here is this kind of clever math problem that's potentially difficult to solve one way, but not the other. So it's based around the factorization of integers. Essentially, if you have very large integers, there's no very computationally efficient way that we know of to factor it. So if you have an integer that's the product of two large prime numbers, factoring it into these two primes is very difficult. And because of that, it actually allows two parties who don't know each other and haven't had kind of a prior exchange ahead of time to establish a shared key. And effectively, with that shared key, they can then use other cryptographic techniques to communicate securely in such a way that their communication is confidential. Which something we don't really think about, but is sort of a major game changer. Like things like, e-commerce. Like, if you go online, you want to buy something from Amazon, and then you input your credit card. You sort of trust that only Amazon is getting your credit card number.
Right.
Which assuming that things go right would be the case. But a large part of that is because of sort of this all this cryptography that's been built upon layer of layers on some of these ideas.
Would you say cryptography is inherently tied to privacy, or like where does the idea of cryptography kind of emerge, or at least for you? Because the way that you put it is people were just doing cool math problems, and then they later figured out it's like, oh, maybe we could apply this to be more private or have secure connections.
Well, I think people did not only do it for the sake of math, although the math is sort of interesting because it's not, there's this whole area of math called number theory that ended up being crucial for cryptography, but that was not, that was something that people studied before they had computers and before they were thinking of anything like encryption or sending message securely. So I mean that the cryptography thing is something that came out of people actually trying to solve some of these secure communication problems, but they had to find the right mathematical foundations for it, right? Because you can't you sort of need theory and concepts and all of that to make the thing work. You can't just you can't get the sort of guarantees that you want without the right mathematical foundation. Privacy is a little bit different in the sense that privacy is kind of really a human sort of construct in a sense. It's something that we care about, and it means different things to different people and works, appears different in different contexts, right? So, if you and I are having a private chat over some secure communication application, for example, like Signal, WhatsApp. It will use, or WhatsApp, it will use cryptography, and that's how it guarantees sort of confidentiality and therefore sort of the privacy of our conversation. But privacy means something broader than just that, and in fact, just the ability to have a secure a conversation, in a secure way with cryptography would be something we would call more like confidentiality. We want a conversation to be confidential. Privacy can involve other things, right? Privacy can involve you can collect some data about me, and that's fine, but I want to have some control over what you can do with it, which doesn't necessarily involve cryptography, right? So think of cryptography as a set of tools that we can use to solve various problems. Some are security problems, some are confidential problem. Some, in the right instances, can be privacy problems. But privacy is broader than that, in the sense that there are some privacy problems that you can solve and approach without sort of traditional cryptography.
Okay, and is differential privacy, does that fit into cryptography?
So differential privacy has this. It fits definitely in kind of some sort of theoretical computer science, at least in terms of the formal notion, and in data privacy. Some people kind of put it as part of cryptography. Some other people do not. It doesn't really matter where you sort of.
Right. Okay.
But the idea is that differential privacy is really the one successful notion of privacy that we've been able to formalize and that we can actually guarantee things about. So we can, we have this one notion that encodes a specific meaning of what we might mean when we say privacy, but we can now build algorithms around it that we can prove satisfy differential privacy, which is of course useful.
So where would that fit in our lives? Because those math talk, it kind of can go over one's head if one's not thinking about, well, how does that affect me, or where does that enter in my life? And maybe also the question that you can answer is like, what is privacy for you at least, and why would we care about it?
Okay. So maybe I'll take your second question first. So,
okay.
What is privacy? It's, I think there are kind of two ways to think about it. One is that you can think of privacy as like, I don't want certain data about me to be used or collected. And then there is sort of privacy as a more of a control thing where, maybe it's okay to collect some data about me and maybe use it in some ways because I can get some benefits of it. Think of various things. If some advertiser knows some data about me, they can serve me ads.
Skateboarding, that you would throw you advertisers of good skateboarders. It's something you would like.
Yeah, something like that. But then you want some level of control about how that can be used, and you want some ability perhaps to remove that data or recall it or see it in some ways. I guess a concept here that's useful is the GDPR law in Europe that essentially has a bunch of things that you might want for privacy. So, for example, one of them is the right to have your data removed. So if you're doing business with some company, at some point you can say, I don't want you to use my data anymore. And they essentially have to do that.
Yeah, they can make it difficult, but they it's cool.
So that's sort of privacy. Now, why people want privacy? I mean, that's sort of, an individual question. I think that will depend for some. Clearly, some people don't want privacy as much as others, right? There are people that are, totally happy to have their entire lives on social media with sort of no filter, and that's how they look at it, and that's fine, right? And if we have to have, privacy, legal and technical frameworks, then they have to enable that to be the case, but they also have to enable perhaps people who are maybe more conscious about the information that other parties have about them and want to have some level of control or want to limit how data about them is shared for whatever reason.
Yeah, and I think there's also you're right. It is individual in the sense that how one defines privacy, one wants to share. But I think you could also argue that it's for everybody. It's really not that hard to think of ways where having your privacy out in the public can damage you in some way. And And yeah, and you can define damage however. It can be financial damage, it can be even physical damage, right? It can be, for example, it would be the that you put your data in one of these like 23andMe genetic things that can like look at your history and has a bunch of data of your ancestors, and it could tell you that, oh, a bunch of your ancestors died of a heart attack, so you're probably likely to die of a heart attack. Would you want that? And I would think that most of the people would not want that information to be on, for example, like their insurer, because it would say, oh, you're more likely to have a heart attack, then I will charge you more. And it's not really something you chose. Like, it's something that got publicly because, yeah. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is actually a law in the US that prevents, I believe, insurance companies from using information, genetic information that way. But I mean, I think the broader point here is that we as humans in general are kind of bad at understanding the consequence of having some of our data out there. I think for two reasons. One is we don't really, we're not really used to imagining what can go wrong when we have data out there. We sort of think, well, this is fine. The other thing is that having some data about you out there, allows more information to be inferred about you in some cases, right? So there's a kind of there's kind of an effect where you think that, for example, you've given, I don't know, Facebook or some social media company some information about you, but then because they know sort of how different information of different people relate to each other, there's a lot more that they can actually infer about you that you wouldn't know, and they're not going to tell you. They're not going to tell you that, if with this different piece of information, they can infer this thing about you. And I think people, when they realize that, and there are cases where they actually, run into that problem, they found that sort of fairly creepy, that, some company where you thought, okay, here's the information I'm sort of, giving them, and then you realize that there's a whole lot more that they have as a consequence of having given that, initial set of information.
Yeah, and when I was doing the insurance example, it's not necessarily out of malice. They could come about it as reasoning of, oh, you're more likely to get a heart attack, then I have to charge you more. Then you get into the gray areas of Facebook, of social media companies, of how they use your privacy in ways that a lot of people don't agree, and ways that other people do agree. It's like, okay, yeah, they're doing something. It's not bad. But then definitely it comes, there's the possibility, and it does happen, that your data could be used by people with not great intentions, right?
Absolutely.
You could get some sort of information about you from any, like a data leak, something like that, and then you get your password out there, then somebody can just steal your password, sell it for another person, or just use it to get into all of your accounts, get your credit card information, steal all your money, and you didn't really do anything wrong, and you got damage financially, and as I said, you can even you can get physically damaged when you have your data out there. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think we're bad at sort of thinking about some of these consequences. I mean, there are things that, like, you can imagine sort of nightmare scenarios where, I don't know, you decide to do a genetic test, and send your DNA to one of these companies, and in exchange, maybe you're trying to get some useful information about perhaps diseases that you might be susceptible to in the future. This great kind of personalized medicine sort of idea. Maybe that helps you. But people, I don't think of what could happen. So one thing that could happen that well, what if that company gets sort of acquired, somebody buys it, and then they use all that information that they rightly kind of paid for whatever purpose they want. And depending on how the privacy laws are set up, I mean, that's there's nothing you can say about that. The other thing is that some information that we sort of might willingly confide in some party, like your genetic information, like your genome, it's in a sense irrevocable, right? So when you give that information away, you have to think, well, what else is going to be discovered in your lifetime about the genome, right? So like people might do these genome-wide associations, like these GWAS, where they look at sort of genes and correlation between genes and various phenotypes and things like that. And so you might find out 20 years down the road that, oh, you have this rare marker that makes you predisposed for whatever certain kind of thing. And now, well, that's out there and that's known, and you couldn't have even thought that would be discovered. But once that's sort of discovered, the cat is out of the bag, and you're sort of stuck with having this piece of information about you that doesn't change, that perhaps defines more of who you are than you'd like to think, and it's sort of permanently out there and not under your control, right? So
and I think it's not all bad. Like the cool thing that I've seen researching about your work a little bit more is there's definitely stuff that we can do to solve these problems, right? There's definitely techniques of sharing your data in a way where it's useful for the other people, but you also keep some sense of privacy and anonymization, or not necessarily like a tight link with that data. So there's definitely cool things. Like, for example, you could talk about like how your research relates to like membership inference attacks, which is this idea of when you have these machine learning models. It doesn't have to be machine learning, but specifically for this, when you have these machine learning models, people could know that your data, it's like if you're a patient of a hospital and the hospital uses your data to train like who's likely to have cancer or not, and people could do something attached to that hospital to know whether you have cancer or not. But the cool thing about you researching this topic is that you're figuring out how those attacks works to prevent them from happening, and to also establish some sort of connection between you and the hospital so that it's less likely for that attack to happen, or even provably that's not going to be like a link between you and your data.
Yeah. So I mean that sort of brings back up this whole idea of data privacy and these techniques. And the way to think about it is that all we were just talking about sort of privacy and having data out there like your genome. It doesn't have to be that if you want to get the benefits of mining your genome for some useful purpose of you,
which is relevant in future.
Yeah, which is useful. Necessarily means that your privacy will be harmed by it, because we have tools, whether they're sort of cryptographic tools or more data privacy statistical tools like differential privacy, that actually lets you, at least in the ideal case, compute certain things about private data in a way that doesn't actually compromise your privacy, or doesn't compromise it to a large extent. So perhaps since you bring up membership inference attacks and machine learning, there's something here that we can explain as an example. So, if we train a machine learning model on a bunch of sensitive data, could be, the medical records of all the patients at the particular hospital. We're typically training it to do something useful with it. Maybe we're trying to figure out how to predict, which patient is likely to be readmitted from after the hospital stay from complication, for example, something like that, or predict, reoccurrence of some disease, or all sorts of things that would be useful to know. And we're using this data not to compromise its privacy. We're using it so that we can do these useful things. And in principle, there is no reason why you couldn't train a model that essentially learns to generalize, right? That learns to pick up the statistical patterns about the training data and maybe generalize them to apply to the broader population, right? Examples and data of individuals that was not part of the initial set of data that you had, the training set. And at the same time doesn't actually necessarily compromise your privacy, just in the sense that you could use that model and then maybe you can't say anything about anybody's particular disease or what happened to them to get into the hospital or something like that. But the problem is, like, when we look at the current machine learning techniques that we have, that's actually not what happens, because what happens is they tend to memorize some of the data that they've seen during the training phase in a way that you can extract to some degree after the model is trained. So the example of a membership inference attack would be one such example.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is that there's no particular reason why that has to happen and you can't do anything about it. You can, if you can understand why it happens, you may be able to mitigate that problem. You may be able to basically, have the usefulness of all this private data without actually putting it at risk of, compromising the individual's privacy.
And from looking at your research, it was interesting to see that a lot of the research going on in these fields, it's centered around how to attack better. And it's interesting because it's you like the kind of the philosophy that you get from it is understanding how to attack better, you understand also how to defend better. Yeah, like could you basically is that the philosophy behind it? Is that like you have to break some eggs to learn how to put the egg back together?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a general kind of mindset and feature of sort of the computer security and privacy kind of research. You have to sort of understand the problem before you can fix it. So a lot of work is, as you say, for example, centered around kind of attacks, because that's how you sort of demonstrate that something is a problem. And so what we've sort of gotten fairly good at is trying to think of new ways that, for the privacy example, trying to leak some private information, demonstrating them, and then hopefully eventually with the understanding of doing that enough, you can come up with effective ways to prevent that from happening. But you sort of can't start at the level of the defense first, because the defense can only exist once you know that a particular attack is possible or not. So a lot of the work we do in computer security and privacy is really trying to map out or characterize the attack surface of the system. So if you think of a system, you can think of like its attack surface. What are all the ways that it could be attacked? And once you have a good handle on that, then you can try to start thinking about what are the kind of defenses that you could use to kind of close off this attack surface, right?
So if you have a house and you could try to think how to get into the house, and of course there's a door, so you lock the door, but then somebody else, I could get into the window, and you then close the window. It's like, I can go to the chimney, then I'll just put something in there, right? So I think it's cool, and even if you have something that, I'm not sure if this is a worry even of attacks that cannot be defended against, then at least it's useful that that's a possibility. So like maybe like in an abstract example, it's like, if you know that you're making transactions with the bank, then there's probably something that somebody can get your credit card number then okay, maybe I won't use my credit card number, right? That's useful, and that's of course like a made up example, but is that a thing?
I mean, it can be, depending on, usually that would be largely prevented by the kind of cryptography we have and other security measures. But yeah, that would, if that was the case, there would be such so an example, a real life example of this might be, if you go to a website, like some e-commerce website, you want to buy something and you're about to reveal your credit card, but you realize that it's not using what we call HTTPS, or sometimes TLS, SSL, TLS, right? You don't see the padlock on your browser window, or it says connection unsecured. Then that should be a sign that actually the cryptography that's supposed to be there is not there, and maybe you should not go ahead and reveal
right. It is useful, yeah.
your information. But yeah, absolutely, that's sort of a good way to think about it.
Yeah, and also the memberships that can come, the attacks into these models can come in many ways. Like one cool one I think you talked about in your course is, imagine that you're in a self-driving car and somebody shows a picture to your car that makes the car think, oh my god, I'm gonna to go into a bridge or something, and I have to like go to the other side of the road, and then increases your likelihood of getting into a crash. That's real, like that's a possibility.
Yeah. So that's what we would call sort of adversarial examples, where this comes up is that we're solving problem, or trying to solve at least problems like self-driving, with machine learning type, deep learning type approaches. And one of the things that people realized in the last 5-7 years is that although these things are pretty good, and we've talked about some of the great applications, and in some cases there are specific tasks where these models are actually better than kind of human performance, they're actually brittle in some way, which is that if an attacker can give you exactly the wrong input, it can actually influence what the model is going to do. And if the model is part of a system, let's say a self-driving car, then now all of a sudden you don't know what the self-driving car is going to do, right? So what you have to think of is, well, if you're designing a roadside recognition model to be integrated in a self-driving car, in a way, not only does it have to work in kind of the normal environment where car drives around and it sees stop signs and red lights and so on, but you would also want it to be robust against a potential adversary that may use that model as an attack vector, right? Because if that's possible, then you have a problem, right? And so now what we start to kind of think about when we look at this system that incorporate machine learning is we have to think of the machine learning components of the system as part of the attack surface, right? Because they themselves could be attacked, right? So, if you think of a traditional car that doesn't have any machine learning because it doesn't have any self-driving, it's just an old car that can basically drive and the human just steers. There's no significant sort of computation happening. Then we know sort of what the attack surface, right? If it's not connected to the internet, well, you can't really hack into it. And so we understand what can go wrong, right? Maybe mechanical failure can go wrong, or sabotage can go wrong. Somebody can poke a hole in your tires or whatever, like something like that. But now if you have a self-driving car that has some machine learning components, not only do you have to worry about the rest of the car, but you have to worry about that too, right? So you have to worry about, can the car be hacked because it's connected to the internet in some way, or can the machine learning model in the car be hacked because it's not robust in one way or another.
Yeah, and there's people working on that. Like,
yeah,
so knowing that that's a possibility, again, knowing that that's a problem, makes an opportunity for people to go there and try to solve that problem, right? And try to come up with ways to make the model robust, of make it less likely. And even like it could be like non attacks with not really bad intentions to her, like you could consider this attack like if you're in a self-driving car and just a kid steps into the front of the self-driving car because he knows that the self-driving car is not gonna run over him and it's just gonna stay there. So that's like a funny thing. So you have to like think about that this is a problem and you have to like somehow go around the kid that's just messing with you.
Yeah. So that's what we would call a type of denial of service type attack. I mean, by analogy to the more traditional denial of service attack on the internet. But yeah, I mean, I think the broader theme here that we should perhaps flag is that it's one thing to solve a problem sort of in the lab, or sort of I don't know, you come up with your machine learning model, but then once you want to actually build a system around it and deploy that in the real world and make it work at scale, then you have all these additional issues that you have to start worrying about. And the interesting, I guess, security issues that I worry about are, well, what if you're deploying you're deploying the thing in the real world, but it's not that the real world is benign. There's now some adversary, right? There's somebody that's trying to actively make the thing not work or make something bad happen. And so now you have to start thinking, well, what could they do? How do you prevent what they could do? And so on.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because that you could ask the question of like, okay, but why are they doing this? Like, if they are computer scientists and you learn all the skills that could be useful and put into like something useful, why have these attacks? And that's like a broader humanity question.
I think,
right?
Yeah, I think we have to sort of also think that one is, it's not necessarily the case that we need to have somebody trying to attack something one way to make it a problem worth solving. Because, for example, in this example of the self-driving car, even if nobody is going out on the road and trying to create these, adversarial road signs, it is a pretty bad problem from just kind of a robustness of the machine learning model by itself, that these things are even possible. Like in an ideal case, if you really think of what it would mean to solve the self-driving problem, surely you would want it to be robust to that kind of attack as well. The other thing is that it's not always obvious to see ahead of time why somebody is going to do a particular attack. So an example maybe I can think of here is this idea of ransomware. I'm sure many you may have heard of ransomware. Some other people may have heard too. So ransomware is where you have some malware that gets into your computer and then encrypts your file. And then once your file are encrypted, they know that you can't get access to them because you don't know the encryption key.
Like a computer virus.
And then it's a computer virus that basically encrypts your file. And then they ask you to pay some ransom, right? Some money, maybe in Bitcoins or something like that, to get the decryption key so you can get back access to your file. And so the point is, if you think of it this way, if somebody had thought, before ransomware was a thing, what if somebody breaks into your computer and they don't mess anything, they don't delete anything, they don't do anything bad, they just encrypt your file? You'd say, well, why would anybody do that? But now we know, well, if somebody does that, they can get a ransom from you, and actually people do pay the ransom.
Yeah.
So just because something doesn't seem ahead of time to be, some attack that people might want to do, doesn't mean it won't be. I think, perhaps the best way to think of attacks and which one we should consider to be important to deal with is not based on whether we think somebody would want to do this attack, but based on the feasibility of them, right? So I'm much less concerned about an attack that is very difficult to orchestrate for whatever reason. Maybe it's just extremely difficult to make it work, compared to an attack perhaps that's easy to make it work and has maybe the same consequences, but I just can't think at the moment of why somebody would perpetrate that attack. But so that's sort of the idea.
Yeah, and it sort of asks the question to go into the topic that I also wanted to talk to you about, that is fairness, transparency, and or maybe you could even call it like ethical programming, which is a deep hole in itself, because it's like, okay, now that we have seen as humans that software impacts our life tremendously, and the impact is gonna continue to increase. Knowing that, what can we do, or should we think about using that power in ways that wouldn't hurt other people? Like, could you think, maybe we can start do you think computer scientists should have mandatory like ethics classes or something like that, or there should be like an ethicist in every software company, something like that?
Well, I don't think it's limited to computer science for
That's
you know,
true.
for starting. I think
That's
I mean
true.
I do think there is I do think we should be thinking about ethical implication of our work, and there is actually a fair amount that's being done on that. When for example, when we submit papers for publications, sometimes we have to discuss sort of the ethics of certain things, because you obviously want to be careful around that. But yeah, I guess the more general question here is that it's one thing to kind of theorize about stuff that you do, and then it's another thing to actually put it into practice, because then once you want to deploy something in the real world, then you have to start thinking of all these things that you mentioned, so whether it's fairness or transparency, and you do start to have to come up with solutions. I mean, I think that's quite clear. If even if you sort of gave me the I don't know, the best neural network to predict some kind of medical intervention that I need or not, and you ran it on my data and it said, oh, Vincent needs to have surgery for whatever reason or something like that, I would probably want to have some way of figuring out if the model is actually picking up on something real. I might want to talk to a doctor. I might want to try to figure out why the model is saying that I need this thing, right? So when you put stuff into practice, there are all sorts of additional consideration that come into the picture, and some of them are ethical consideration, but others might just be consideration that you need to have users trust the system, right? Particular, I think one of the reasons why a lot of people are starting to look into transparency and interpretability and explainability of machine learning is because they realize that if you want users to trust those systems, it's a problem if they're a black box, right? Like, are you really likely to trust a black box when the decisions that you're going to make with that black box are kind of high stakes, right?
Yeah.
If it's what to have for breakfast, maybe you'll just follow that recommendation. But if it's something serious that has real world consequences, then you probably want to understand,
Yeah, and there are systems making it, like you could call it life-changing decisions. I think there are systems that are like making some sort of judicial, or at least assisting in judicial cases. So like, who should be put to jail, who should not be put to jail. I'm not sure if that's like a myth, but probably there are, right? Probably there's, and how you come about doing those is really, really important, because you could say, oh, now my algorithm that could assist this prosecutor or judge or whatever, is that gonna look at your race, at your gender, at your age, where you live, and you could go on, and yet those implications, that those questions, that's something that you've mentioned that it's worth thinking about. Because, like, is there maybe a way to ask you is, are algorithms unfair, or can they be unfair?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. It's not necessarily that algorithms are unfair. It's that, um, the kinds of algorithms we're talking about, like machine learning algorithms, their behavior really depends on the data you give them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, even if the algorithm itself is not unfair, there is a question that, arguably you should ask yourself, which is that, could the outcome, which in this case would be, say, the model, could that become unfair because the data that you have and that you give it, is perhaps it could be biased, or it could be not representative of the population that you're trying to apply it to. There could be all sorts of reasons why, the data is not good. And if you just go and you just apply this in the real world without kind of thinking about it, then you risk, some of these issues.
Yeah, yeah. And could you also, maybe to put it closer to people's, could you think of like ways of how an algorithm would be unfair, or how you would feed data into an algorithm that would make it unfair?
Actually, that's a good question. It's not obvious how you could perhaps feed data to make the algorithm unfair. I mean, I'm sure you could find some way to do that if you really tried. But it's more that, if you have data that, for whatever reason, encodes some historical bias, then the machine learning algorithm, these models will basically learn whatever statistical patterns are in the data, right? So, if there was some pattern that is unfair, that's maybe some kind of discrimination that was happening for some reason in the past, and it ended up being part of your data set, there's no reason why the machine learning model that you've basically trained saying, well, here's the data, here's what I want you to learn, just find the relationships between the input and the output in this data. There's no reason that it wouldn't reproduce some of these things, right?
Right, and I think also you could get into the question of, if the data seems to be biased, is that in and of itself a problem? Like, for example, an easy example that I was thinking is, if you see that younger people are more likely to be in a car crash, is it okay to charge them more or less if you're renting a car to them? Like, you're kind of discriminating against them, but you're discriminating against them because the data says they, as a population, are more likely to be in a car crash.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think ultimately what we have to do is we have to sort of think of what we mean by wanting a model or a system to be fair, because there are different ways that you could think of fairness, right? So in the example that you give, the idea there is that, well, is it fair or unfair to charge, let's say, younger male drivers, I don't know, higher car insurance because statistically they're more likely to drive recklessly, right? It's clearly true that that's the case. So perhaps if you look at it like this, you might say, well, that's not unfair. Maybe that's justified by the data. On the other hand, you could say, well, maybe we want a notion of fairness that doesn't actually penalize, individuals that make up the group based on behavior of the group, right? So certainly when we pull up this kind of statistical information, although it's definitely true, it's not that every young driver is reckless, right?
Right.
So then, effectively, if you think that's okay, you're basically saying that you don't really care if it's unfair at the individual level, and you justify that by sort of the group statistical trends.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are kind of active sort of debates and area of research where people are, looking at various fairness notions and how to think about them and check if a particular machine learning model satisfies a particular notion of fairness. And there are many different flavors of this because people, again, mean different things by fairness. So there are notions that have to do with group fairness, where you look at maybe disparities between groups. And then there are notions that have to do with individual fairness, where you basically think that similar individuals should basically get similar decisions made about them. And so there the focus is looking at individuals and not necessarily kind of groups.
And for example, how would that work? Because how would you define similar? You have to define it like in some sort of group way, right?
Yeah. So I mean that's there you get into the detail, and that's what's tricky about many of these definitions. But for example, you could ask the following. You could say that if you have two individuals and maybe they only differ in their race or gender, then you would want any model for any decision of any consequence to give the same outcome to both of them, right?
Yeah.
That would be one way to, for example, define
that. Yeah, and it's also I was thinking that it could become really messy because you could get in just the nature of the probabilistic nature of this makes it tricky. That okay, so let's say that if we put as a philosophy or as a principle to not treat individuals based on group statistical analysis, then you could say, oh, then if my ancestors are more likely to have heart disease, then I don't care about that. I'm just gonna eat all the McDonald's that I want because I'm the individual, I'm not represented. Yeah, you could get into like this messy area that's basically what I'm trying to say is that it's really hard to talk about these topics because even the experts are not agreeing into what is fairness because it's a messy topic. So is there any way, like, what would you say should we even try to get an agreement with everybody, or should we just try to do our best, our own of what we think?
I think we don't necessarily need the experts to agree on the fairness notion we should use. I mean, we need the users of the systems, because ultimately the users of the systems are the one that have to essentially live with the consequences of the decisions made. So in a sense, it's more like what do we think of as fairness as a society, right? That it's like I'm sure there's a lot to think about and debate there, and I think maybe the experts in fairness should be thinking about well, suppose you have some fairness notions, how do you make sure that a model meets that notion, for example, which is not to say that you can't have maybe new notions of fairness so that it's not useful for experts to think about them, but ultimately we're not building those models for the experts to use. We're building them for everybody to use, right? So it's kind of it's the same thing. I would say the same thing for example for privacy, right? So if you're building a system and there is some private data or sensitive data that's being collected and you want to preserve privacy or safeguard it in some way, protect it, what you ought to ask is what do the users of the system want, and what do they mean by privacy, and what would they like the system to be able to guarantee in terms of privacy properties and things like that, right?
Yeah, and there's most likely research about that, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Asking users, making polls, figuring out what
Yes.
exactly people mean
Yes.
about this stuff.
With one caveat that privacy is one of these things that's often an afterthought,
Yeah.
right? So, the product comes first, the company comes first, they find some business model to make money, and then at some point, maybe people are like, oh, privacy, what should we do about it now? It's like, but yeah, there's absolutely research on that, and the research is actually quite interesting. I mean, there's different people do really feel differently about privacy, right? It's definitely not the same for everybody.
Right. All right. So, as we're wrapping up, do you have advice for people who's interested in the stuff that you've done, who maybe doesn't know really how to get into them, or just advice in general for people like me, people that are starting their careers?
I guess it depends to which target demographic you were talking about. But so, people that think that they may want to go into whether it's computer science or machine learning AI or security and privacy, I mean, there's a lot of interesting problems to solve there. I think many of the fields have been able to attract sort of, a junior and some newer people to start being interested in that. And I think that's great. I think certainly there is plenty of interesting problems to work on. Maybe what I would say is that some of these things require a good amount of kind of background to really get into. But not so much that it should kind of scare people out there, right? I can imagine sort of high school students thinking, well, I don't know how much I like math, and is that stuff really needed? But I do think AI, machine learning is cool,
right?
But so there are things that you sort of need, but it's not at the level that you have to feel that you have a particular talent for mathematics to be able to do machine learning. I mean, maybe at the level of theory you do, but at the level of kind of building machine learning systems and things like that, there's plenty to do, as long as you can sort of get your mind around sort of the what I would call sort of the basic math, which would be a little bit of linear algebra, some differential and integral calculus, a little bit of optimization, things like that.
Yeah. Do you have advice for people in general? And
that's a very general question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I have general advice for people. I'd say, yeah. It's too broad. If you can narrow it down, maybe I can,
another way to drill into what I wanted to get from you is, for example, what are you grateful for in your life?
Many things. Maybe too many things to enumerate. I mean, obviously, my parents, my family. I guess I'm grateful more professionally that I feel I was lucky to kind of discover what I wanted to do in terms of at least field of interest early on. I was fairly early on kind of fascinated by computers. So for me, kind of doing computer science was not, any kind of accident. And then I've sort of been kind of lucky ever since, in the sense that I've always kind of found the next thing that I was interested in and kind of just did that. But I realized that that's not the case for everybody. I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that you look at something and they're not quite sure. They might be interested in some things, but they're not so interested that it's kind of obvious to them that that's what they should be doing.
And what would you say you would have done if you were in that situation?
I think I probably would have tried a bunch of things until I found one thing that I really wanted to do. and I don't know what would have happened there, but yeah, I think there's no, there's no way to know what you're going to enjoy and what you would be happy kind of spending most of your time doing, unless you at some point try to do it. It's the same thing I say to students who want to get involved into research, but they don't know if they like it, they don't know if they want to do a PhD. It's like, well, the best way is to try it, right? Take a semester, try to do a research project. You'll know once you spend any significant amount of time on something. I think you'll figure it out whether that's for you or not. I will say I don't think there is any reason that we won't get there. Like, I don't think there is anything special about the human brain that could not be replicated by right algorithm.